So I've searched far and wide, and the most what I have discovered or come up with, what I find useful, is the issue of living and dead traditions. I mean, that's, again, you find it in the manga book already, and it's something that I've been thinking about, again, for a long time. Way back in the 90s or 70s or whenever. He said Chinese medicine to all extent and purposes is dead.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Qiological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. My grandfather used to say, if you have your health, you have everything. As a kid, that made no sense to me. How could it if you're basically a healthy child? You've got enough vitality to grow through childhood and into adolescence. And as a young adult, I still did not understand because I didn't have everything. I barely had the capacity to make enough money to pull my own weight in the world. There was latent capacity, still undeveloped. I suspect this is actually what my grandpa was referring to. If you have your health, then you have the energy and vitality to develop your potentials. It was not that I had everything, but rather I had a shot at developing the measure of my life that was within my grasp. Maybe another way to say it is that I had an opportunity to realize and embody the potentials that were mine, or could be if I put in the work. It's not that health means you get everything you want. Wants come and go, fluctuate with the desires or complaints of the moment, ephemeral and changeable as wind. I conflated everything with a kind of Christmas list of comfort and pleasure. I failed to notice that the world requires our attention and dedication to something bigger than our petty desire. That in unfolding capacity, there was an opportunity to discover something of my Ming, my destiny. Not destiny as in assured outcome, but destiny as in unfolding the hidden potentials that give rise to meaning and connection that comes from overcoming obstacles, finding courage in the moments where it's sorely needed, and finding the windfall of surprising capacity when it goes from latent to flourishing. As with any words of wisdom, what you first hear and what those words mean are usually quite different. I think my grandpa was right. If you have your health, then you're free to engage the obstacles that in turn lead to everything you've got the potential to manifest. He never did say it was easy. How do we lean on a past that crosses centuries, language, culture, and oceans without resorting to fetishization or wistful imagining? How to take the essence of inquiry from doctors of the past and use it not as a prescription, but rather an enlivened inquiry. We live in a world of change and yet practice a medicine rooted in ancient principles. Conventional medicine is built on change, but Chinese medicine always keeps one foot in the past and the other in the evolving present. The issues of continuity and change are ever present in our trade, and that is the topic of this conversation with Volker Scheid. Volker is a doctor, historian, and anthropologist, and I enjoy that he has a knack for uncovering illuminative questions. We'll get into all this in a moment. Stay with us. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear-Don't-Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients. And then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lyle, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com, and where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AcuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit acufastneedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
Welcome to Shop Talk. In this portion of the podcast, we are bringing you roughly 15 minutes of practical, clinical methods, perspectives, and advice that has its work boots on. This section is all about practical material that you can begin to investigate the next time that you walk into clinic. Additionally, visit the show notes page for supporting materials from this week's guest on Shop Talk. All right, roll up your sleeves. Let's get to work.
Hello, good day. This is John Scott. I'm a doctor of Oriental Medicine. I came out of acupuncture school in 1982, founder, president of Golden Flower Chinese Herbs. And welcome to this Shop Talk. Okay, so today I want to talk about some applications of the Watou Jiaji points. These are marvelous points to use. And, in school they were taught, okay, the bladder points, urinary bladder points are more for your organ, more direct tonification. Your outer bladder points more for essence and emotional aspects of those Zangfu organs. And the Watou points, because of the way that there are work with the spinal nerves, are even more direct for physical function. And so these are marvelous points to use. And so the recommended treatment is needling perpendicular, oblique towards the spine with either half sun or 1 sun depth. And that will vary depending on where on the spine you're working.
if you're in the upper thoracics, you don't want to go deep there. So these points regulate and harmonize the 5 Song and 6 Fu directly by stimulating the specific spinal nerve. And while these are marvelous points with very broad applications, there's a couple of applications that I would like to go over here. And there's a number of great protocols in various textbooks, like the comprehensive text we called the Shanghai book back years ago for herpes zoster, otherwise known as shingles. And this is something that I incorporate with great success. So with, shingles, it's a manifestation of the varicella virus, which is the chickenpox virus that is dormant in the nervous system. And we will typically contract chickenpox when we're a child. And then as we age, and typically often under a period of great stress, the shingles will manifest as a very painful blister types of outbreak. It's painful and terribly uncomfortable besides that. And, there's some protocols for working with supporting yin, clearing internal fire are really important. But here's what I've found that can really speed up the relief. Okay, so where is the outbreak? Is it on the abdomen? Is it on the leg? Okay, there. Where is it? Okay, here it is in this intercostal space. Now, okay, it's very tender there. You don't want to touch the blisters. And you come back around to the back, and you're pressing in the intercostal area, going around the back, going back to the spine where it attaches to the spinous processes. Okay, so, and you're going to find probably 2 or 3 very tender places there. And so this is where you want to needle, in those tender places. And you want to needle those as deeply as appropriate. And you can manipulate those as, pretty strongly, because you really want to work with sedating that pain. And you'll find that the results and the relief from this particular auxiliary treatment will be really appreciated. And, I remember I had a patient, he had shingles all down the outside of his leg. And I asked him about it. I said, well, and it was massive. I mean, kind of the whole medial side of the leg was covered in shingles. And he mentioned, oh, this has happened before when he did cocaine. And you would say, you should stop that. But, so then, of course, I'm needling in the sacrum. But this is a really good treatment. Now, there's another level that I want to mention. The third sacral segment, that area is really wonderful for urogenital issues. And I've used that for genital herpes, so what I'm doing is I'm needling on the dew channel above and below the third sacral segment and the Watto points obliquely inward on each side. And I've had people on the table who are having an active outbreak, and when they get off, the outbreak is gone. Well, and of course, you have to catch it before the blisters pop and when it's just emerging. But this has been a really wonderful treatment. But of course, you do want to use other appropriate points. Now, but I've also found, I remember I was working with a couple with fertility issues. Now, the wife actually gave her Nourish Essence, which is just a kidney formula. And she had a history of miscarriages. And the Nourish Essence was really ideal for addressing that. But her husband's sperm count could use some help. So I said, what if I did those points that I mentioned for genital herpes? His sperm count tripled from the test before and then after the treatment. It's like, oh, okay. That was good. And I've also used this point combination for prostate issues, especially older gentlemen. And these are really good points for improving prostate health. Of course, the prostate is fed by the liver, spleen, kidney, renin do too. So what happens as we age, damp heat can accumulate in the liver channel and congest the prostate. And as the kidney qi declines, we can have damp accumulation. And then also, of course, the spleen, of course, where people, really want to talk about diet with prostate is, with kidney and spleen issues, you can have damp accumulation that congests the prostate. So, using constitutional treatments, working with the affected channels is going to be really an important strategy. But these particular Watteau points are really going to be helpful. And no matter what the setup is, and you see people that have a history of alcohol will encourage your zinc to be excreted. And zinc is really, really, really important for prostate health. With liver channel issues, you want to talk about alcohol and zinc and, hey, eat pumpkin seeds and get more zinc in your system. But I found these Watteau points to be really wonderful. And just want to mention that we have some really effective herbal formulas for prostate. We founded Golden Flower Chinese Herbs because of our concern about imported products that were contaminated with pharmaceutical drugs. But over the course of the decades, we've designed formulas to address prostate issues. We have formulas that address damp heat in the prostate. We have formulas that address benign hypertrophic prostate. And we do have formulas that are also appropriate for shingles, working with antitoxin herbs and herbs that support yin and clear internal fire. Come to see us at www.gfcherbs.com.
Volker Scheid, welcome back to Geological.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be back here talking with you again. I really like your podcast. Yeah, I told you that before, but I want to say it publicly too.
Well, thank you. It's, it's a curious thing. I'm kind of an introverted person. And I can remember so often as a student, like not wanting to speak up or ask questions because I felt stupid. And now here I am with this podcast where I get to ask all kinds of questions. It's really curious how if you do Chinese medicine long enough, it will maybe change you in some fundamental ways.
Well, it brings out the best in you,
So we've had a little conversation over the email over the past bit of time, and I'm always curious to know what you're digging into, what you're thinking. You're one of those folks who you like to go off into different directions, and you like to go deeply into those different directions. And it's often kind of off the boundaries of the beaten path. I'm thinking in particular of the book you did on the Menghe clan some years back, where you really went into looking at these doctors from Menghe and the society of the time and like the social capital people had with each other. And it wasn't so much about medicine, although there was some things in there about medicine, but like how people were with each other and how society is. And, those are things we don't think about so often when we're busy practicing in our clinic. And then again, through our conversation in the email, you brought up this idea that you're working on of continuity and change. And Volker, that really rang a bell for me because, we practice this incredibly traditional medicine in some ways, but we're also alive in a modern moment. And especially as East Asian medicine has found its way into the West, there's all kinds of other ways we have of thinking about our medicine that comes from having found a root in the West. And so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, as you know, maybe the people who don't know me, I'm both a practitioner, but I'm also a kind of like what you would call a professional historian. So I have kind of like a dual career. And those two careers, they both work well with each other, but they're also sometimes difficult to hold together because you look at things that interest practitioners. As practitioners, we're interested in what works for my patients. How can I help my patients? As historians, as you say, if you look at the Menghe book, you're really interested in other things. You want to know how the medicine functioned in a society at a particular place and time. And those questions are, sometimes they converge and sometimes they don't. But I think continuity and change is something that I've been thinking in Chinese medicine. I think that's something that's important for all of us, I would say. If I look at Chinese history historically, it's always been important and it's important for any kind of knowledge practice in the sense of what about the knowledge that we have do we keep? And what don't we keep? What do we develop? So, like say, if you look at kind of Jin Yuan doctors, they discuss that issue, and the famous saying is kind of like ancient prescriptions. The past and the present don't run on the same track. Ancient formulas are not appropriate for modern diseases. So it's not a matter of biomedicine. That's an issue that has come up throughout the history of Chinese medicine. So that is a question that is kind of like of historical interest to the historian in me, but it's also really important for the practitioner in me. It's kind of like something that you address, that you talked about before we went online, is like life only has got so many years in it for all of us, and each day has got only so many hours. So what do we concentrate on? What do we read? What don't we read? What do we go into depths? What should we look at superficially? Those are important decisions, and if we can get some guides as to make these decisions, then I think that's helpful. And for me, rather than come up with guides myself, I've been trying for a very long time now to figure out what guides, because, as I said before, because Chinese medical doctors have been thinking about this issue for at least a period that I'm familiar with for the last 1,000 years. And what resources can they give us to think about this question? So maybe that's what we could talk about in this podcast.
We often think about the past as informing the present with Chinese medicine. And I mean, in some ways, we really make a fetish of the past. I know I have, especially when I first began as a practitioner. So, yeah, looking at these questions, I think especially too, Volker, as we, in this particular modern moment, it's funny, I was, I'm saying in this particular modern moment, but I'm also thinking that you said, yeah, we've been discussing this as Chinese medicine practitioners for the past 1,000 years, right? So there's that. So maybe the current present moment is not so much different than the other present moments that have already unfolded. What have you found in looking at this that people have been discussing and thinking about, and how have they moved forward?
Well, I think there's two aspects. So the one thing is that the one that you just mentioned, I think it's really important to look at how people have thought about it rather than, I think there's a tendency for us Westerners, and we are Westerners who do Chinese medicine, so let's just talk about us and not about other people. But there's a tendency for us, which I think comes from two sources. A, because we are Westerners, and B, because most of us, we don't know enough about the history of Chinese medicine, which is, not a criticism. It's just like, how could we? Because we're practitioners, not historians. But there's a tendency for us to kind of like reinvent the wheel and think that, like you said, this modern moment, this kind of like, for instance, the disjunction between biomedicine and Chinese medicine, or between whatever, that's really something unusual, that's special, but it hasn't been. So I think in a one way, simply recovering how people have thought about it is therefore useful for us. It makes us, on the Westerner in us, a bit more humble, and B, because they have really thought about it. And the people who thought about this are people who, they were really deep thinkers. So I think they can help us with that. So that's one reason of doing it. Yeah. Okay. The second aspect of the whole thing, for me at least, is to find, because Chinese medical thinkers and doctors, again, have thought about this problem in a range of different ways. And some of these ways are very similar to, like if you look at, for instance, one of the debates, like you said yourself just before, that has or is still going on here, is like this, let's not say fetishization of the past, but there's some people who think the past holds all the answers, and then there's other people who think, no, Chinese medicine has to go with the times, it has to be developed through scientific research or even AI or whatever. So if you just want, for argument's sake, divide the field into those groups, I mean, as I said, those arguments have been always going on. But I think what I have been trying to do, and what can tell you a little bit about, is I want to find ways, and in Chinese medicine there have been different groups having found different solutions to that. To me, the most interesting solutions are the solutions that don't come necessarily from within the field of medicine. Because once you go within the field of medicine, then the people who have to make these, or who think about these issues about continuity and change, they also have other fish to fry. Meaning that, you always, as a doctor, especially as a Chinese medicine doctor, past and present, you're usually self-employed, isn't it? You need to make a living. And if you need to make a living, you need to market yourself. And you whether you like it or not, you're competing with other people. So defining yourself as this and that, like saying, I'm a practitioner who belongs to this lineage, or I'm a very scientific, I'm professor in this research institute, blah, 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 blah. I work in this hospital, or I do this. That's always invariably, it's, we cannot help it. It's also part of marketing, isn't it? Yes. And I think that's always been the case. So when Chinese doctors say, I belong to this lineage, or I come from there, or I'm the teacher of this, or we should always go to the past. That's also it's always been bound up with, let's call them issues of marketing or identity formation. And once things get involved, or muddled with identity formation, then the question that I'm struggling with, or we struggle with, like continuity and change, then becomes a little bit more kind of like hazy or foggy to see. So I've been trying to find ways that are Chinese, so to speak, or that come from within the Chinese tradition of thinking, but that are not necessarily, or as much as it is possible, not about identity issues within the field of Chinese medicine, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so you bring up the word identity. That's such a big concept right now. People fight really strongly for their identity these days. We have identity politics. We have senses of identity built on, whatever we think our identity is, or whatever we think we are. Maybe it's always been that way. You look into the culture of, like, the United States, for sure at this moment. I'm not sure about Great Britain or Europe. And identity is a huge thing. But again, not new. When we look back and we think about practitioners at other times, again, I often will come back and think about the monks. They for sure had identity, like, who was my teacher? And, you could lean on that kind of social capital to get patients. And so often these days, people hate marketing, like, I don't like marketing, and, it's terrible, it's awful, we have to do business. But like you point out, Volker, Chinese medicine doctors, by and large, have been self-employed forever. And these are issues we've always had.
But there's nothing wrong with it, like, say, take the Hmong people, the very idea that, one of the things I found out, the very idea that they started calling them Hmong people is Hmong medicine, because, those people emigrated to Shanghai, and suddenly in Shanghai they were confronted with people who came from different parts of, particularly from Jiangsu and from Zhejiang province, but also from other places in China. And suddenly people knew there were a few famous doctors in medicine. So you said, I'm a Menghe person. Does it make sense? Yeah. Whereas in Menghe itself, nobody would have cared. There, it was important that you came from this family or that family. Yeah. This teacher or that teacher. Yeah. And so it changes from, in the context that you are. And what you mentioned, the issue of identity, I live in the same time as you. So I've also become aware that identity is a very big issue. So from that perspective, finding a handle on continuity and change within Chinese medicine that is not so much inflected by issues of identity can also be, I think, have a third effect, namely be therapeutic for us if we're so concerned with identity. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, especially as identity at this point is kind of a weaponized thing.
Yeah. So I've searched, far and wide, and the most currently, this may all change again, as what I have discovered or come up with, or what I find useful, is the issue of living and dead traditions. I mean, that's, again, you find it in the Menghe book already, and it's something that I've been thinking about, again, for a long time. And the first time I started to think about it is Paul Unschuld, in a book that he wrote kind of like way back in the 90s or 70s or whenever. He said, Chinese medicine to all extent and purposes is dead. It's like a tree that has withered. The wood might still be useful, but the roots have died. And I think at another point, he also compared it to Latin. Kind of like Chinese medicine is like Latin, still useful, but it's dead. And I thought, is it really dead? Is it like that? Or is it not? And I've come from another perspective to the same problematic. Namely, and that's to me the interesting thing, I discovered that there's a certain place in the history of Chinese medicine. It starts in the 12th century or 13th century. People start talking about living methods, 活法. So they say, okay, you're using this. This is a sign that you're using a living method. And I've come across, and this becomes then in the, this 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, and even now. I mean, you read Chinese, you must have come across that. People will talk about the 活法, a living method. And a living method in the way that a lot of doctors use it is something that is really appropriate to a particular place and time or particular patient that has got some connection to the past, but it kind of reinventing is not the right word, but it makes it come alive in the present moment. Does it make sense? So something that comes alive in the present moment. And for them, the characteristic of a good, effective medicine, a medicine that's worthwhile to enact and pursue and transmit, is kind of a medicine that is alive and that generates these kind of living, or that lives on these kind of, that is alive through its enactment of living methods in every situation. Yes, okay. So to me, I hope it's okay if I keep talking, huh?
Yeah, no, I'm just following along. I do want to interject for just a moment, though. As you talk about living method, as you talk about how ideas, theories, practices of the past, in whatever way, come down into an individual's consciousness and awareness and skill set, that's one thing. But for that to kindle and become alive in the moment with a particular patient, in a particular place, for a particular issue, I mean, for me, Volker, that is the joy of doing this work.
It is a joy, but the question then is, how does that happen? How do we make it happen? What are life methods in Chinese medicine? And if there's life methods, that means there must also be dead ones, because otherwise everything would be alive. So this tension between life methods and dead methods, that's for me a way of maybe how we can think about continuity and change without the issue of identity, if that makes sense. Yes, because of course you can say, oh, I'm the guy who does all these life methods and come to me, but your patients wouldn't understand that. And actually nobody in the field of Chinese medicine that I can see at the moment uses this very much. So therefore to me, it's first of all, before I say any more, it's a good analytic. Does it make sense? Yes, to think. So the next question then is, how can we be more specific about what we mean by life and death methods? And so I started looking where this actually comes from, because it comes at a certain, as I said, it comes in the 12th century. I don't think, if you look in the Shang'an Lun or in the Yellow Emperor, I'm not an expert on Han Dynasty methods, or if you look at Ge Hong, I don't think they use this term life methods. So it comes around 1200. And it most likely, if I'm not totally mistaken, it comes from poetry. So...
Poetry?
Yes, poetry. And because at that time, in the history of Chinese poetry, people started to talk about life methods in poetry. And so this idea of what are life and what are dead methods is something that doesn't come out of Chinese medicine, but it's been assimilated into Chinese medicine. And if you think, poets deal actually with the same problem that we deal with, yeah? Because a poet has to write poetry that is alive for his audience, isn't it? That is meaningful for his audience, that makes that people want to read, that what people want to listen to. But why do they want to read and listen to poetry? Because it also changes something in them, isn't it? Yes, it makes a difference to them. And as you know, in poetry, sometimes, like for me, there's a few German poems that I had to read in school. There's one by Goethe, and there's another one by Rainer Maria Rilke. It's about the panther. And these poems are still within me, and they, I could recite them by heart, and they, they've been there for hundreds of years, and they speak not just to me, they speak to, those poems have spoken to, millions of Germans, yes.
Well, not just Germans, Volker, people all over the world those words have spoken to. They've spoken to me. I read them and I go, oh, that's right.
So maybe you could compare that, take the Panther by Rilke, or Goethe poem, you could say, or Shakespeare sonnet or whatever. You could say, oh, maybe that's a bit like Zhang Zhongjing, like a formula. It's like Tang or whatever. Yes, it's been there. It speaks to millions of people all over the world, many different situations. Although you have to find, the Panther Rilke will only speak to you in a particular moment, yeah? It will not speak to you in every moment, yeah? It will only speak to you in a particular moment. So if you kind of do a poetry recital, you want to know that both your audience and the moment is right for reciting the Panther. But on the other hand, say you are a poet, one thing is, to be a reciter of other people's poetry. And maybe as doctors, it could well be that is what we want to be or what we need to be. But maybe as doctors, we need to be also generators of new poetry. So take, a typical example would be COVID. So when we had COVID, some people said, oh, well, that's no problem. Chinese medicine has always dealt with these kind of things. Just use these ancient formulas, blah, 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 and that will work. And if you look at the history of COVID, if you look at COVID, and then people would say, oh, yeah, Shang'an Lun has always been around. But it's actually not true. If you look at the history of Chinese medicine, epidemics have always been moments when new things have happened. Like the whole Buchung Ichi Tang, take Buchung Ichi Tang as an example. That's a wonderful formula that all of us use maybe all the time. Comes out of an epidemic situation, isn't it? Yes?
I did not know that Buchung Ichi Tang came out of a epidemic situation.
Most people don't know that, but it came out of all that, the Li Dongyuan stuff and particular Buzhong Ichijiang comes out of an epidemic situation. Yeah, maybe we can talk about that another time. But then, even Zhang Zhongjing comes out of an epidemic situation, yes? And then the Wen Bing, if you look at one of the ways you could write the history of Chinese medicine would be like these big transformations that come. One of the big generator of change is epidemics, when things don't work anymore that used to work, yes? And then there can be other situations, like I'm heavy into the 17th century, and in the 17th century, again, most people don't know that, but one of the problems in 17th century was what they called the cult of the emotions.
Cult of the emotions. This sounds like today.
Yeah. As I said, things are very, actually, what these people were suffering from is very much, and how doctors responded to that is very similar to nowadays, burnout and emotional, dealing with all the emotional stresses. But again, there's something new, that the way people express their emotions at that moment in time and how they dealt with their emotions, how they thought about their emotions was very, very different than 100 or 200 years earlier, or 100 or 200 years later. So there's something new. And in these new situations, maybe we have to create new poetry that's more resonant with a particular situation. Maybe we have to create medicine that is more resonant with that new situation. And poets or literary theorists, in using this term of living methods and dead methods, they thought about how do you become a good poet, a poet that can respond to these situations by creating poetry that's, alive and meaningful and resonant. And the reason I think it's a good model for us, or a good way for us to think about it, is because in Chinese poetry, at least, in the history of Chinese poetry, or in the history of art in general, and also whether if you look at calligraphy or painting or so, how do you become a poet? And how is the field of poetry constructed? The field of poetry and the field of medicine are not so different because they're in the same culture. You have these ancient models that you admire. So in Chinese medicine, this would be like, say herbal medicine, this would be Zhang Zhongjing or Sun Tzu Miao. These old guys who produced the kind of standard, so to speak. In poetry is kind of like the Tang. Tang poetry is like, that's the late Tang. That's this ideal that maybe you can never go beyond. Can you ever go beyond Zhang Zhongjing or Sun Tzu Miao or the Neijing or whatever? Can you ever go beyond that? If you can never go beyond it, then some people said, well, just learn their style, copy their style, do that, and then, well, that's all you can do.
Good enough for a mere mortal.
Yeah. And others would say, well, yes, no, actually, no, that's not good enough. You get a new situation, or you get COVID or whatever, the cult of the emotions. No, we have to generate art, poetry that is alive for this moment. And how do you do that? And they, obviously you always have to start with the ancient models. You have to know in poetry, the rhyming and how you construct a poem, etc., etc., etc. You have to learn that. But then eventually you have to free yourself from that. And this process of freeing yourself, so at a certain moment, just imitation becomes dead, because it no longer, in poetry, because it no longer resonates with the moment. In medicine, because, and we've seen that through the 2000 years of Chinese medicine, because the medicine simply stops working. It doesn't work. Or at least, that seems to be the evidence, yeah, okay? And then people need to create something new. And how do you do that? I mean, in poetry, that's actually a very, very clear model for us, I think. It could be a clear model for us to think about these issues, is because they don't set up a tension between, like in our thinking, between it's either traditional or it's modern, yes? Okay? Like Either it has to be past or it's... No, actually, you can only produce living methods if you're totally immersed in what has been there or what is there. Does that make sense? Yes, unless you have really studied Tang poetry until you start dreaming about it, until you memorized all these poems, you can talk, you know them by heart, you can recite them at any meeting with your friends, even when you're totally drunk, you know which poem to select for which particular situation. You know the rhyming schemes and all of that. Only then can you move beyond it. Does it make sense?
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. It does make sense. And it's one of the things that I've considered over the years. This is tangential in a way. I remember way back, even in school, there were some of my classmates who worked in a much more intuitive fashion. And, I kind of scratched my head and go like, where are they getting that? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's connected to anything. And I'm doing my best to connect it to the stuff that I'm learning. And they're just kind of going in and intuiting something and thinking that's good enough to do the work with. And I don't want to throw any shade on intuition. I think there certainly is a place for it. And maybe they were extremely skilled, like way more than me. That's because I'm not a particularly intuitive person. So, I get it. Grounding yourself deeply in something gives a kind of stable framework. I'm speaking strictly for myself. A stable framework that I can stand on, that while standing on that stable framework, I can see and understand things with my own intuiting or knowledge or experience, and it has a place to be. I'm not just dreaming it up and hoping it works.
Exactly. And the issue that you raise there, I mean, this, of course, is also, again, an issue that these literary theorists have already discussed, because it's the same problem for them. Do you just go in there and, of course, if you're a genius, maybe, but even a genius, like you have to be, even if you're a genius, to write a poem, you have to, that your audience will appreciate, you have to have known something, even like Goethe or Rilke that I talked about before, they weren't born and picked up a piece of paper and wrote the Punter, yeah? He read and doesn't make sense. Even a genius, they have to have immersed themselves in something. But this issue about, is it more intuition or is it more repetition? That is an issue that these people discussed. So as I said before, if we try to engage a little bit with these processes, then I think they can help us navigate, the very question that come up for you, like in this situation. Is it okay? To what extent can we base ourselves on intuition? To what extent do we just have to keep repeating? The idea, of course, would be that repetition in the end allows you to become free, yes?
I think it can. If I don't turn it into a fetish and become sort of enslaved to it, then I think it can. I had an experience, Volker, I'm such a slow learner. This only happened maybe 5 or 6 years ago. When I was in school, I had a teacher, Dr. Xie. Everybody loved Dr. Xie. She was great. And I remember in her teaching us acupuncture, she'd always say, okay, you've done these yin points. You've got to do a yang point or two to make sure everything's balanced. And that went in. And whenever I do acupuncture, if I had a bunch of yin points, I'd be like, oh, yeah, right. I better put in a yang point. Right? That's what Dr. Xie said. And at a certain point, a few years back, I mean, Volker, repetition for like 20 years, right? At a certain point, I was doing a treatment. I had a bunch of yin points in, and I was really working in particular some of the engaging vitality work that I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to. And everything felt great with this patient. It's all yin points, and everything, it's just like everything is wonderful. And Dr. Xie's voice and her image pop into my mind. She's like, don't forget those yang points. And I had this delightful moment of, oh, I don't think I need yang points here. Thank you, Dr. Xie. But not here, not now. And I saw it. I realized that I've been doing this repetition without realizing that I've been doing this repetition up till the moment where I recognized what's in front of me is fine the way it is. And then there was that break. It wasn't a break because Dr. Xie was wrong. It was a break because in this situation, it was not called for.
I mean, I had a similar experience like we go back a long time. So when we learn Chinese medicine, it's quite different than it's the field of Chinese medicine. When I started, very different than I studied. I remember I did my herb course and we did the Shanganzhun and the Wenbing in 3 hours. That was considered necessary. Anyway, then I went to China and I looked around there and I discovered Ye Tianshi and he's just always spoken to me. I loved it's kind of like a bit like certain poetry would speak to you. His formulas, I just loved it and I really liked it. And I thought, I want to be able to be like him. I went to Beijing Library in the Academy of Chinese Medicine. I went there for a month and I copied. In those days, you couldn't go there were no computers. I had to get the librarians to actually photocopy every article that had ever appeared in a Chinese medicine journal on Ye Tianshi. They made a copy for me. Yeah, okay. And I went home and I really studied this. I tried to practice and it just bloody didn't work. Yeah, not really. And until I realized, if you want to understand Ye Tianshi, Ye Tianshi to me is a poet of Chinese medicine, but he based himself on what came before him, Zhang Zhongjing and all these Jin Yuan doctors. Unless you know them, there's no chance in hell that you can do what he did. Yes, so I went back and put a lot of energy into these earlier people, and then went back to Ye Tianshi, and then suddenly I started to get into the groove, so to speak. Yeah, does it make sense? Yeah. So if you want to become that kind of poet that Ye Tianshi was, you have to, you have to be where he was. You cannot just hope. It's very similar to your issue of intuition, isn't it? Yes, you cannot just hope to jump in there and be it. Yes, you have to do the work, huh? And then maybe you can be. And Ye Tianshi for me is, for instance, a good example of these living methods. Yes, you can see in not all, but all the development of his Wenbing ideas, they really are a kind of a new poetry that is built very, very firmly on the foundations of, particularly of Zhang Zhongjing, some other stuff, but then goes off and makes something new from it. Yeah. And that's to me another good example of living methods. Yeah.
Yes, and there's your continuity and change right there. This also brings something up, Volker. Well, two things. First, I just heard you use the phrase, it didn't work. You put all this energy into something, you get all these copies, you pour over it, you bring it into your practice, you work it. It doesn't really work. I just want to stick a pin in that for a second. I'm going to come right back to it. And then the other thing that you were just talking about is that you couldn't do what Ye Tianshi did without knowing the influences that he relied on. Like, what was the continuity that informed him? You needed to know that before you could like grok his methods.
Yeah, like he writes a prescription, you need to, what do these 6 herbs tell me, They might look very new, but actually it's just a kind of like a new riff on an old melody. Does that make sense?
So going back for just a moment to it didn't work. I think this is really important. This is vitally important to anyone who wants to practice Chinese medicine for any length of time because, and they don't tell you this in school. And if they told you in the beginning in your first student interview that you're going to find out a lot about what doesn't work, a lot of people would never start, me being one of them. And this thing about we can go into something, we can spend days, months, maybe years, put our heart and soul into it, put our mind into it, try to work something out, only to successfully arrive at a dead end.
Yeah, that's life.
How do you get through something like that? Because I think we all run into it.
Yeah, but any poet would do that as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think we expect it from poets and artists, but medicine is supposed to be a more serious scientific enterprise.
But so therefore that maybe, so this analogy or this connection to poetry, I therefore find it useful, yes, because Chinese medicine is not, of course people will nowadays go on and say it's a science, Chinese medicine is science. People talk about, in the Han Dynasty, the scientific physicians, or they already knew about the immune system or whatever. But, science is a word that comes into the Chinese language from Japan at the end of the 19th century. And the Japanese it's a kind of like a new word that the Japanese coined from, when they encountered European science. So until the end of the 19th century, there's no kosher in China, yes?
And it comes from Japan. The actual term comes from Japan.
Yeah.
That's funny.
But because the Japanese modernized earlier, yes? So the Japanese, until about the 1930s, until the Second Japanese-Chinese War, Japan was kind of like the model for modernization in China. Yeah? So but a lot of these words, they sound very ancient in Chinese, but they're actually not. Yes. Okay. So I don't think we can think about Chinese medicine in. Okay, that's actually a good. I'm going to go off in a slightly different tangent now. Yeah, but staying with the alive and dead. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now I hope this will not be too complicated, but this tension between something that is alive and dead, the interesting thing, and that's why I think it can be potentially so productive for us. This tension between alive and dead, I mentioned before, Unschuld, etc. But it also occurs, for instance, in I'm a historian, so it also occurs in academia, particularly in the humanities. And one of the ways they use this idea, live and dead, is so if you study nowadays, yes, if you're whether you're a scientist, biomedical scientist, or whether you're a anthropologist or a historian, how do you study something like Chinese medicine? Or how, not just Chinese medicine, could be like, could be anything that goes on in India or in South America. Usually, or almost invariably, you're using some kind of modern Anglo-European framework to think about it, like, for instance, science, yes, okay? But in that way, and without going into the details, so some of the So the idea is that only these Anglo-European ideas are truly alive, because they are what helps us to understand everything. And these other things, like Chinese medicine, or I don't know, weaving in India, or magicians in the Amazon forest, their theories are dead because they don't allow us. So like the way a magician in the Amazon forest thinks doesn't allow us to think about our problems. So that's why for me, this idea of using this framework of life and death methods that comes out of Chinese poetry, if you can follow me, in order to think about Chinese medicine here and now, is much more useful for me, because I'm recovering something that is still alive in Chinese medicine, rather than using, science. Or I'm not saying that is not useful, but that's not what I want to do. Because if I use science or like I have done, like I'm as guilty as anybody. I used, if you look at a lot of my earlier work, I used kind of like modern science studies, ways of thinking to think about Chinese medicine. But in doing that, I condemn Chinese medicine to death. What I have to do if I want to keep Chinese medicine alive, I have to find ways within Chinese medicine to think about Chinese medicine, even think about things outside of Chinese medicine, or ways like to me, this living dead method that comes out of poetry to think about Chinese medicine. For us, that is something that keeps Chinese medicine alive. Can you follow that? Yeah.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner, because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi, and that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
I do. And I also appreciate, Volker, your awareness and forthrightness in doing the best work you can do, because that's the kind of person you are. You have at times used that Anglo-centric view. Hey, look, fair enough. It's where we come from. It's very hard not to use it. So you've taken it, you've used it, gotten what you can from it, found things that are useful, found things that make it dead. And then now here you are looking to invigorate Chinese medicine, realizing, oh, I need a different model. Chinese poetry, huh? How might that be helpful? It's really cool. Volker, you're like a mathematician. You show your work. It's wonderful to go wrong for the ride.
Thanks. But I think it's very important for us to be wrong, isn't it? Yes. And know that we can, very often we are wrong, isn't it? Yes.
I think it is. And welcome it, if that might be the right way to say it, as part of the process, as part of our teacher. And being wrong, if we take it without too much self-criticism, learn the lesson, it can be so helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A lot of people have problems with being wrong, but
it's a whole different conversation, isn't it?
Well, it's a different conversation. But again, so if we would have to go into and this is obviously not the right medium for that, but the people who have thought about these living and dead methods, the people who've done literary theory and the people who've done the thinking, they really have thought about this, yes? And it actually ties in, and the way they think about it, remember, these are people, in 12th century, 13th century, 15th century, 17th century. They think in ways that ties in with a lot of what we do, like qi and qi dynamic and tung, bian, and hua, and all those words that we use in Chinese medicine. So like a good poem has to also tung in the same way that connect in the same way that good Chinese medicine must tung. So I think it's a mind for us to mind, and maybe other people, maybe talking to you here, other people can get interested in it. And I want to give you another example of how, for me, this helps me to be very clear about what is life and what is a good direction and what is a bad direction, not a bad and not so good direction, because it's like one of those cul-de-sacs. It won't lead us somewhere. Yeah. Okay. So, I've done a lot of research on menopause. Yeah. Although people who don't know me, I've spent one of the research projects I've done was on menopause. And, when we go to TCM school, we all learn that menopause is kidney deficiency. Is that true, Michael?
Let's just say it's the first thing that's probably going to come to mind for most people.
But it's certainly in the main gynecology textbooks, yes. And again, maybe you have found that in your own clinical practice, doesn't necessarily always deliver the best results, yeah. And one of the things I did in the course of this research, first of all, I looked at how this idea that menopause is kidney deficiency came about. And it's very obvious it came about as a translation of estrogen deficiency into a Chinese kind of idiom. Because if you can look at any classical text, there's no discussion of menopause as a problem, because menopause was just a normal thing, isn't it? Yes. Also, there's a lot of cultural variation in how women experience menopause. So we cannot be sure that even if women in the, in 3rd or 14th century China would have gone through the menopause, they went through the menopause, but even if they would have had symptoms, we cannot be certain what kind of symptoms they would have had. And I've talked with, I've done interviews with the people who actually were involved in creating the textbooks in the 1960s in which menopause gets defined as kidney deficiency. And so it gets actually translated from a biomedical idea. Biomedicine says menopause as a problem is hormonal deficiency. Okay, what does that mean? Oh, Chinese medicine, hormones is kidney, so therefore it's a kidney deficiency. And then what you've done here is you translated one kind of, whether you want to call it, one piece of writing, you translated it into something else. But you made that something else, the Chinese medicine, you made it dependent on Western medicine. But it gets created as a fact within Chinese medicine. It gets portrayed as if it was not, people don't say, oh, in the 1960s, we didn't have any better idea to think about it. That's why we came up with this, but maybe in 20 years' time, maybe we should change that. No, Chinese medicine, of course, because of the way it's constructed, it has to say, well, this was already in the, in the Huangdi Neijing, and which is obviously not true. So you create a false kind of fact. Biomedicine can then change because it's alive. Can you follow me? Biomedicine can change and it's alive. But Chinese medicine, by having created this false kind of fact, is now stuck.
Yes, because we always look backward to try to understand our present.
How difficult will it be for us to get rid of this fact? How difficult?
Well, maybe if a lot of people listen to this podcast, it would be easier.
But it's going to be very difficult. I can again tell you that from my own experience. I try to get evidence that this is not a fact, and I have evidence, I have loads of evidence. I published lots of evidence from many different angles, from surveys of the literature, from surveys of patient presentations, etc. I tried to get it published in a journal, and the reviewers, I tried to get it published in I went through the peer review process, and the reviewer said, well, actually, you are contradicting the Chinese medicine textbooks. So therefore, that shows that you don't understand Chinese medicine. And as you don't understand Chinese medicine, you don't know what you're talking about. So therefore, you have to reject this paper. Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Well, that calls into question a whole lot of things about the peer review process, doesn't it?
I got it published in a biomedical journal. This calls into question the peer review process, but I got it published in a biomedical journal. It calls to me into question a process whereby Chinese medicine goes down the road of certain death by not developing itself according to living methods, if you can follow me. Yes, okay. But by simply copying something from somewhere else, biomedicine retains for itself the right to change all the time, to be new, different, etc., yeah? Whereas Chinese medicine, and you could observe the same thing, or at least I have observed that. If you observe what happened during the COVID pandemic, obviously my sources of information are limited, and maybe I'm a bit biased, whatever. But when I observed what was happening in biomedicine, both in the literature, but also in, talking with biomedical colleagues, they were always, we have never seen something like this. And they adjusted, and we have to do it differently. And we learned as we went on. And I talked to osteopathic colleagues. We have never seen, we learn. And then I read Chinese medicine was, no problem. This is Chinese medicine knows how to deal with epidemics. I haven't seen much. I'm really sorry to say I haven't seen much of a learning process within the Chinese medicine community. And I can understand why that is, because we are so socially weak. That's one reason. But, if we think that life, as you said before, one part of life is to be open to make mistakes, to be wrong, to not know what we're doing, and out of that not knowing create something that is alive, like a poet. Poet doesn't get up in the morning, maybe he gets up in the morning and he knows, this is it. But more often than not, you will see his room full of papers that he, you have seen these movies, where somebody tries and they write something and then they throw the piece of paper away, and the whole room fills up with jottings that didn't work, yeah. So,
Volker, you just made a comment here. One of the things with Chinese medicine is that we're socially weak. I'm not sure what you mean by that phrase. Can you fill that out a little bit for me?
Well, we have no social power. We are at the margins, yes? We are kind of we are weirdos. I mean, you go to a party and then, I know, I'm a historian, I'm a professor of history, and I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner. If I go to a party and, people ask me, what do you do? I have two choices, isn't it? Yeah. I can say I'm a professor of history, or I can say I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner. If I say I'm a professor of history, it's not quite as good as a banker, but it's okay, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
If I say I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner, yeah, maybe, we have to, people think, this could be a potential weirdo, isn't it? Yes. So, I mean, that. We have no certain, if you're a doctor employed things are changing. It's not the same anymore in don't know how it is in America, but a lot of people in Europe don't want to become doctors anymore because they don't earn any money anymore. It's not like a generation or two ago, if you were a doctor, if you were a consultant in a hospital, you were made. That's not happening anymore. But biomedicine, of course, had a lot of social status. The people who would practice medicine would make decent money. But even Chinese medicine practitioners, a lot of Chinese medicine practitioners struggle, isn't it? Yes?
Well, a lot of us do. I think some of that, honestly, and this could be a different conversation, but I think a lot of it is self-inflicted.
Of course. But there's no, like you get out of Chinese medicine school, there's no certainty for you in life, isn't it?
I didn't go into Chinese medicine looking for certainty. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking for certainty and you go into Chinese medicine, you're going to have a rough go, and you're going to kind of have to awaken to that. There's not a lot of certainty, and either you get friendly with that or you go into real estate.
In America, I don't know, in the States, insurances will pay for what you do, don't they?
In some places, not where I live. But then there's that whole other side of, well, now you're an employee of the insurance company, which means you're somewhat limited in what you can do and how you can work and how much you can earn.
Yeah. Well, socially weak, I give you a very good example for socially weak. In the UK, when COVID hit, we were forced to close our practices, yes?
Same here.
Osteopaths and doctors didn't have to.
Right. There was a whole question of who was essential and who was not, which really, I mean, who wants to be called non-essential?
That's a very good example for who is socially weak and who is socially strong, isn't it?
Yes. That showed us something of the power structure of the culture. But Volker, back to the living in the dead and what poetry has to tell us, how it might help us. For those who are listening, and this has been a wonderful conversation. I think in particular, I'm struck by recognizing, just how often I look through my Anglo-dominant culture perspective. But then again, without some work on my part, there's no way not to do that. And even if I want to look through a different set of lenses, I still have to be aware of the lenses that I've acquired through the accident of my birth and where I grew up. We all have that. It's not, it's not a crime. It's just a possible benefit depending on how you use it, or obstruction depending on how you use it. So there's that. The thought of, wow, okay, these 12th century poets were struggling with the same thing that we're struggling with here in medicine, and that this is a part of the culture that also our medicine flows from. So, Volker, how can we build a bridge into that work and maybe see what they saw?
There's no causal influence, but I mean, one thing you need to know about poetry. Poetry in China was a little bit like what popular, how do you call it? It's not no longer rock music. It's kind of like
popular music.
Popular music, whatever comes under that. Yes, it's for us, isn't it? Yeah, it's just like, well, everything. Yes, everything you can find on Spotify or wherever. Yeah, on Apple Music. That's part of, everybody's listening to music these days. Yes, so I think poetry, if you want to get an idea of what poetry meant to kind of like the elite Chinese that produced the medicine that we are using. I mean, they were invested in poetry in the same way that we are invested in music. Yeah, so everybody was listening to it, reading it, reciting it, trying their hand at it. They would meet for a gathering, then they would have kind of like they would drink and recite poetry and write poetry in the spur of the moment. So everybody could do a bit about that. And as I said before, in poetry you have these movements. At a certain period of time, people will go in more for the more innovative stuff, and then at other moments they will say, "Oh no, that's this kind of like you said, following your intuition. Oh no, that just produces bad poetry," and then pendulum swings back again. So, for instance, what good example here? I hope I'm not upsetting somebody by saying that, but this current fashion for Jingfang, like for ancient kind of stuff.
Jingfang. Yeah, usually the Han Dynasty stuff, I think, is what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that comes from, as far as I can trace it, comes from the first time that Zhang Zhongjing was categorically separated from any other doctor in the history of Chinese pharmacotherapy. As far as I can tell, is a guy in the mid-16th century. Yeah. Before, Zhang Zhongjing was always just like a special guy, but just basically like everybody else. But then you have something happen, and he becomes very different.
In the 16th century,
Mid-16th century. Yeah.
mid-16th century. And who popularized him at that point?
Well, that's another issue that we can discuss some other time. Yeah. No, because it's a bit more complicated than that. So, but anyway, and then you have a little bit later, you have in Chinese thinking this something called like fugu, like return to the ancient. Yeah. Okay. But the first people who became invested in fugu, in returning to the ancients, were actually poets. There was a big movement in poetry in the 16th century to go back to the ancients, yes, to model yourself on, as I said, in poetry, it wasn't something in the Han, but it was the late Tang. So you have this fugu movement in poetry, and roughly around the same time, the first Chinese guy, the first guy makes Zhang Zhongjing totally different from everybody else. There's other influences on him, but what I want to say is, what happens in poetry and what happens in medicine is not all that different. And then you have a reaction against this, going back to the past. And I was talking about Ye Tianshi before. Ye Tianshi's famous opponent, let's call him like that, or friend or colleague. Have you ever heard about Xue Shengbai or Xue Xue?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, no, not off the top of my head.
So Ye Tianshi was this very famous guy he's portrayed as the guy who invented Wenbing, or one of the main inventors of Wenbing, and he was living in a town called Suzhou in China. And he was very, very famous. And there was another famous guy at the same time. He's called Xue Xue or Xue Shengbai. And Xue Shengbai wrote one of the most important, or he's attributed to him, one of the most important texts on also of Wenbing, damp warmth, a treatise on damp warmth. But the two of them were kind of like colleagues, but also, there's loads of popular stories about their competitiveness. Yes, okay. For instance, Xue Shengbai had a clinic, and his clinic was called like Sao Ye, like sweeping away the leaves studio. And Ye Tianshi is, of course, called, his surname is Ye. Yes, okay. So sweeping away the leaves was interpreted as a kind of like a dig. So just to give you a flavor of what was going on there, yeah?
So, I'm thinking in the modern day, we have poetry slams. You have poets going up against each other. It's like, oh, you think you can rhyme that? Well, listen to this, right?
And Xie Xie, he was also a very, very, very famous poet, an extremely famous poet at that point in time. And his poetry, his way of writing prescriptions was kind of like he had studied with a poetry teacher who emphasized not returning to the ancients, but kind of like things transform and change, and you have to create new things. So to me, like, if I look at his prescriptions and if I look at Ye Tianshi's prescriptions, Ye Tianshi lives at the same time. He was not a poet, but again, there's no causal relationship, but in the same way that you have this fugu return to the ancient at the same time as doctors start to return to Zhang Zhongjing in a way they had never done before. And you have this kind of like inventiveness of this new kind of Wenbing thing going on, influenced in part at least by a doctor who's also a poet and who's very much into creating kind of like new poetry. These are resonances at least, yes, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And, this is going to sound cliche, Volker. We say in Chinese medicine, often enough, it all comes down to yin and yang.
It does.
Right? And so we have inventiveness, we have stability, we have things that are becoming, we have things that have left a trace from the past. and they're all important. And because life is moving and constant and searching and inquisitive, we do swing like a pendulum. We're here, we're there. You go over enough to one side, you learn something interesting, but that's only a part of the story. And so you swing into this other place based on what you now know from having lived through a particular experience.
Yeah. But as I wanted to make clear with that example of menopause, yes, how we can construct, like it's not just like, just go ahead and do it and, yin and yang. Of course it will eventually swing. But if we want to keep Chinese medicine alive as a tradition in the long run, then we should try and avoid going down that track if we can.
Mm-hmm. So this leads to, I think, a very potent question of how do we know that we're going down the live track?
So for instance, one example that I gave, and that's why I wanted to give it, if you, in this process of translation from a biomedical disease into Chinese medicine, you surrender your vitality because you say, okay, biomedicine creates living stuff, biomedicine can change, and we just have to adjust to that. We are no longer producers of anything. Then you have surrendered your vitality. If we simply copy old stuff, then we also have, then if we only copy old stuff, if the past, like you said in the very beginning, you used the word fetishism is also a way of how you can surrender vitality. So what we need to struggle for and what we have to think about or should think about, what are the things that keep us vital? And I've given you 2 examples of things that don't keep us vital. And, if we would talk about it more, maybe we can find some others. We can find things that keep us more vital, and we can find things that keep us less vital. And so obviously, want to keep Chinese medicine alive, let's do the vital things.
Yeah. I appreciate your nod to the concept and experience, really, of resonance. And I also tend to have a bias, I guess, these days, more for questions that hold a potency beyond answers that give me a sense of satisfaction. And so having you suggest that we attend to not surrendering our vitality, I think that might actually be a good place to put a bookmark in it for today. And, some other time we can come back and pick up on whatever we want to pick up on, because there's a lot here.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. And thank you for inviting me. Thank everybody for listening. And talking about these things is always an opportunity to think more about it for myself too. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Volker. There's something reassuring for me that the questions of continuity and change have been addressed by other creative endeavors. Change and continuity, there's a lens that can be applied to most any collective human endeavor of merit. And if you look closely at yourself, I suspect that you'll notice, as I have, that sorting out what to keep from what to change, it's an ongoing process, not unlike that of digestion or respiration. Somewhere in the middle of the fundamentalist stance of the golden past should inform the present, and the deconstructionist declaration of tear down the old systems of oppression, somewhere in between the fire and brimstone declaration that the Bible is undoubtedly the Word of God and the vengeance of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, there surely must be a place in the yin and yang of continuity and change to inform and support each other. Looking to the 12th century Chinese poets, not a bad start. Finding the voices that can speak cogently to these issues in our modern day, also a good idea. And I rather like thinking about looking into other disciplines besides that of Chinese medicine to see how they are framing and entertaining this perennial challenge. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.